who is currently a Mary Lugton postdoctoral fellow at the University of Melbourne. So she has traveled from Australia to come be with us one day only. Her PhD work investigated the ecology and evolution of phenotypic variation in fish, and she has become a global leader in reproducible and transparent science and research practices. In 2020, Dr. O'Day co-founded the Society for Open, Reliable, and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, which many of us may recognize as SORTEE, an international inclusive organization of researchers focused on improving the culture, practices, and outcomes of the broader EcoEvo research endeavor. So I think something that can bring us all together and thinking about how we do our science and what it means to be part of the research community. I'm really excited to hear what Dr. O'Day has to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shannon. Thanks everyone for coming. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm first going to tell you a bit more about myself and then tell you a story about the open science movement. Preface, who am I? I'm a postdoc. I'm a few years out of my PhD. I started out in research as a behavioral ecologist. I was doing mostly lab experiments with mosquito fish and zebrafish. And then at the same time, I was learning how to do systematic reviews and meta-analyses. But like many students, I was young, I was insecure, and I was very eager to please, and so I worked really hard. But over the course of my PhD, I came to question what all that work was for. What did it mean? What was I doing with my life? You see, I thought that I'd been testing a hypothesis, but on closer inspection, it was one of those loose conceptual frameworks. It's something that spawns a lot of papers saying more research is needed. It circles around these questions, but it never lands on any answers. And I submitted my thesis during the first COVID lockdown in 2020 in a mood of discontent. So then I went in search of similarly discontented people. And I found those people in Melbourne, in an interdisciplinary group of people who study how science is done and how it could be better, meta-scientists. And I also found discontented people online through the process of creating SORTEE, that open science organization. I'll tell you more about SORTEE later. So my aim with this talk is to convince you, if you're not already, to be at least a little discontent with the state of research. But I will also try to convince you that there are lots of reasons to be hopeful about the potential for research to be better. Okay, so you might recognize the structure of the story that I just told about myself. It was in this form: once upon a time there was, every day until one day, and because of that, until finally, and every day since then. It's the Pixar formula. I'll also be following that formula for the rest of this talk. It will be in 10 parts. Part 1. Once upon a time, scientists earned status and jobs by publishing new or surprising results. Now, this might not be true for everyone at every kind of institute, but let's say that it's true for Olive, a PhD student in an ecology and evolution department at a research-intensive university. Our friend Olive loves doing research, and she would love to one day become a tenured professor and run her own lab, and it would be perfect if she could stay close to where her family and friends are. She knows this is unlikely to happen. She's been to career advice workshops, she's read the blogs, talked to mentors, she's heard the stats. She knows that there are way more people who want these jobs than there are jobs available, and all of the grants and fellowships she knows about have really low success rates. But still, she wants to try. So to try to get through these tight bottlenecks, she will be evaluated by selection committees, and they're going to be they're going to be short on time or expertise or both. And so what they will do is they will rely on proxies of Olive's research productivity and research quality. So especially the number of papers she's published, the prestige of the places she's published in, and the number of citations she receives. So Olive wants to publish as often as she can in the highest impact factor journals that she can. She does confirmatory hypothesis testing research, and that she hopes that she will find positive, surprising, groundbreaking results. If you look at what gets published in our journals, then it seems that scientists are finding those sorts of positive results everywhere they look. On this graph, on the x-axis, you're seeing the percentage of published papers that found support for the hypothesis that they claimed they were testing. They're all well above 50%. And now, if scientists are finding support for their hypothesis most of the time, then this could mean that they're being very cautious in the claims that they're testing, that they're not taking big swings. They're testing things that have a high prior probability of being true. But at the same time, scientists write about their results like they're groundbreaking, unique, novel, and important. Those are called hype words, and the use of those hype words has been going up and up in abstracts and in grant applications over time. That hype is on the rise because it's what the high impact factor journals are rewarding. Work that's rigorous but more speculative or exploratory often gets recommended for more specialist and lower impact journals. Olive learns this. She has finite resources, and she wants to allocate those resources in a way that will maximize her chance of getting through those tight bottlenecks. So what happens next? Part 2. And every day, scientists used questionable research practices to maximize their publication output. By questionable research practices, I'm referring to a set of behaviors that researchers do that helps them get published, but at the same time, it makes it more likely that their results don't replicate, that they'll be publishing false positives. If you ask researchers in ecology and evolution, most people are aware of themselves doing some of these practices at least some of the time, and it's probably more common than we think because these questionable research practices are easy to do without noticing that you're doing them. They're easy to justify to yourself. So here we're not talking about outright research misconduct, we're not talking about fabricating data, we're talking about the sorts of practices that PhD students are often taught, things like harking, which means hypothesizing after results are known, and selectively reporting or cherry picking the most interesting results. So perhaps like me in grad school, Olive reads The Scientist's Guide to Writing, which emphasizes the importance of finding and planning your story. She reads, you must decide which information, data, analyses, and interpretation belong in the paper, and which are better reserved for another manuscript or abandoned to a dusty row of old notebooks. Olive has a lot of decisions to make. When does Olive stop collecting data? What does she do about outliers? What type of model does she use? How much should she care about the violation of model assumptions? Which covariates does she include? Does it make sense to include an interaction term? Who knows? Olive faces this garden of forking paths. It's not obvious which direction to go down, so she might try a bunch of different ways and then choose the path that has a compelling result at the end. That's known as p-hacking, and it's the sort of practice that's taught to many students by famous professors like Brian Wanzig. He boasted about teaching p-hacking in a 2016 blog post that then led to his eventual demise. He was writing about a student who was visiting his lab. Quote, when she arrived, I gave her a data set of a self-funded failed study which had null results. I said, this cost us a lot of time and our own money to collect. There's got to be something here we can salvage because it's a cool, rich and unique data set. I had 3 ideas for potential plan B, C and D directions since plan A had failed. I told her what the analyses should be and what the tables should look like. I then asked her if she wanted to do them. Every day, she came back with puzzling new results. And every day, we would scratch our heads, ask why, and come up with another way to reanalyze the data with yet another set of plausible hypotheses. Eventually, we started discovering solutions that held up regardless of how we pressure tested them. I outlined the first paper and she wrote it up, and every day for a month I told her how to rewrite it, and she did. This happened with a second paper and then a third paper, which was one that was based on her own discovery while digging through the data. This whole blog post is amazing if you want to go and read it online. It goes on to contrast the success of that particular student, well done her, publishing all those papers, with a less tenacious postdoc who published at a quarter of the rate and since left academia. In that same year, 2016, Paul Smaldino and Richard McElreath published The Natural Selection of Bad Science. This is based on the pressure to publish or perish. In their cultural evolution model, successful labs are the ones that publish lots of papers, and they do so using questionable research practices. Those labs then train more people who go on to run labs of their own, and they propagate those same bad habits. By selecting the most productive researchers, the quality of science is driven down. Part 3. Until one day, the status quo became intolerable in high-profile fields. Science, as we know, is a complicated cultural process. How can we tell when it's working well? If you build a bridge and the bridge falls down, everyone notices. It's super obvious that your bridge was bad, that something went wrong, and then people try to fix it. But if your research is steps removed from any eventual application, and for fundamental research, it's not so obvious when you've got a dodgy bridge or a house of cards. People have to really pay attention and they have to care to notice. And people are more likely to pay attention when there's fame and fortunes and lives on the line. So this happens with the issue of publication bias in clinical research. Pharmaceutical companies want their drugs to be approved and prescribed and make millions of dollars. So left to their own devices, they will choose to only publish the results that make their drugs look good. Now, obviously that's a huge problem, and so governments and funders had to mandate that all clinical trials be registered in a repository before they begin, and then they've said that all the results need to be published. And then there's issues with compliance, and so, more regulations have to happen to follow through on that, but generally publication bias in clinical research is a problem that's steadily improving. But we haven't solved the problem of selective reporting that happens earlier in the bench-to-bedside research pipeline. It doesn't address publication bias in preclinical research. And a sobering example of this comes from research into treatments for ALS. ALS is the motor neuron disease, where over the course of 2 to 4 years, people lose the ability to speak, eat, move, breathe, and then they die. So people donate a lot of money into trying to find cures, treatments for ALS. You might have remembered the Ice Bucket Challenge around 2014. This was an internet phenomenon that was a fundraiser. And at the time of that fundraiser, there'd been several drugs that had gone all the way to clinical trials in humans because those drugs had shown promise in mouse models of ALS. But in the clinical trials in humans, none of those drugs worked at all. They all failed. So there were some frustrated people who went back to the preclinical trials to work out what had happened, and they found that those initially promising results had vanished. They had all been false positives. So those drugs should never have been given to humans before the results were replicated in mice. The bridge fell down. Now, I think these disasters unfold slowly in complex, boring ways, and that's one of the reasons that it's taken as long as it has for people to be as appalled, I think, by this ethical failure as they should be. It's been 30 years since Douglas Altman published The Scandal of Poor Medical Research. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. Now, not enough has changed in this time because it's hard for people to muster enough outraged urgency about these system-wide problems. But slowly, over the past decade or so, we've seen that the open science movement has grown and it's spread from medical research to other disciplines. Part 4. And because of that, concerns about research waste spread across the life sciences. The open science movement really grew in the 2010s through the concept of a replication crisis. And one of the defining papers of that era was published in Science in 2015. This paper was called Estimating the Reproducibility of Psychological Science. It was a big collaborative replication project led by the Center for Open Science. They enlisted lots of labs to try and replicate results from studies that were published in psychology journals. From 100 different replication attempts, the headline result was that most replications found much smaller effects than the original studies, and most of the p-values were no longer statistically significant. There have since been more replication projects like that, including in economics and cancer biology, and there's been a lot of discourse and disagreement about how to interpret them, but they have drawn attention to how rarely we normally conduct replication studies, how hard it is to even work out what authors did to begin to attempt a replication study. That was a huge issue with the cancer biology project. They couldn't work out how to even do the methods of those studies. And it's also shown that studies can become famous and influential, lead to TED Talks and so on, and at the same time be unreliable. So those collaborative replication projects receive so much media coverage that then those conversations about problems with irreplicable research have spread into other fields before they've attempted their own rates of replication success or failures, including in ecology and evolution. So I think those replication projects have been really influential, but the other thing that's captured people's attention has been these high-profile cases of fraud. My home field of animal behavior has had a few famous fraud scandals in recent years. There's been papers on the effects of microplastics and ocean acidification on fish behavior, and there's been the rise and fall of spider researcher Jonathan Pruitt. So this case in particular, it led to lots of retractions, and some of the journals that were really affected by those retractions have then reassessed their own policies and tightened their standards around data and code sharing to make it easier to detect these sorts of things in the future. So I've been thinking that these fraud cases are to the open science movement what charismatic megafauna are to conservation biology. So the analogy here is the same way that all the effort put into preserving your favorite megafauna could have general positive impacts on biodiversity where that megafauna species lives, fraud cases really cause people to sit up and take notice and introduce more layers of accountability to make fraud harder to commit or at least easier to detect. And that accountability also works to reduce the more common questionable research practices that are done by honest researchers all the time, like p-hacking, harking, selective reporting. Okay, so I'm about to touch on some of the things that have changed as the result of the open science movement and these cases, but first we're going to have a minute's break, so I'll be back soon. Welcome back. Part 5. And because of that, research is becoming more open and transparent. Okay, what changes have we seen in recent decades? Well, transparency has increased a lot. A big reason for this is just that the infrastructure is there to make it possible. Journals are online, you can attach supplemental files to papers, so now people are sharing more results and protocols and details of their methods. Transparency at the same time has been encouraged by the grassroots research community. There's many opinion papers on open science, and people develop guidelines and checklists to increase the reporting quality of research outputs. A big chunk of my PhD was spent developing one of those guidelines and checklists for systematic reviews in ecology and evolution. If you've done a meta-analysis, then you will know the deep frustration of not being able to work out how studies were done or what their results were. But it's definitely getting easier to find the information that you need for studies published more recently. Transparency in EcoEvo was also massively helped in 2010 when a group of journals all jumped together. They decided that from 2011 onwards, the data of their published papers had to be made publicly available and archived, and then we saw Dryad really take off. Now, slowly these sharing requirements are being introduced for the analysis scripts and code associated with papers too. And just recently, some of those same journals are starting to enforce their data and code sharing policies. So they're having data editors who come along and check that the authors are doing what they actually say that they're doing, to check that the data and code and also data descriptions, the metadata, are available for those published papers. Now, in other fields, there are some journals that go as far as having someone check for full computational reproducibility. That means that they will run the code and check that it reproduces the same numbers as in the paper. We're still quite a long way from doing that in EcoEvo, but just in general, I think we're doing a lot better when it comes to data and code sharing than in many areas of psychology and medicine. But we have some catching up to do when it comes to making it more transparent when researchers are doing those questionable research practices like harking, p-hacking, and selective reporting. So the way that you can make that more transparent is with registration or pre-registration. That means you write down what you're going to do before you do it, and then you put that in a time-stamped, publicly available repository. This is, as we discussed, mandated for clinical trials. It's still pretty uncommon in psychology, but it has increased a lot in recent years. Most of the literature around pre-registration is a bit aimed too much at, say, hypothesis testing research, but there's still value, I think, for doing it for exploratory research, if not to just prevent yourself from harking to say, look, we're just going out to measure a bunch of things, and then it's clear that you don't have a hypothesis that you later, spin around your paper. But there are limitations to pre-registrations. One of them is that it's entirely on the researchers, but also it doesn't do anything to address the issue of publication bias at journals. So for that, there's registered reports. This is different to pre-registration. I know that it's pretty confusing that registered reports and pre-registration sound so similar, but they're distinct things. A registered report is a change to the traditional publication model. So in a registered report, you submit before you've run a study, you submit your abstract, introduction, method to a journal, and that gets sent out for peer review. And so you can get reviewer comments back. You might revise your methods, so that's a benefit. You actually have a chance to improve your study before you've run it. And then eventually the journal can give you a provisional acceptance where they say, we agree to publish your study regardless of what results you find, as long as you do what you said you were going to do. And obviously you can justify small deviations from those methods as they come up. So this is a really powerful way of addressing both selective reporting at the level of the journals, publication bias at the level of journals, and selective reporting of the authors. And there are some journals in ecology and evolution that offer registered reports. I'm hoping more will offer them. There's often resistance from journals because they want the ability to do the publication bias. They care about their magazines. But anyway, I'm hoping these will become more popular. Another change we've seen in recent years at journals is they've had more pressure to be more transparent about how they operate behind the scenes. So some journals are publishing the peer review history of their papers and publishing the names of the handling editors. And of course, for many people, open science is most closely associated with open access, with the push for scientific outputs to be open and free for everyone to read. So there are major funders who require that researchers will publish their research outputs in open access journals, or at least make all their research outputs freely available by using preprint or postprint servers. So preprints were used by physicists for decades, but they've gained a lot of traction now in the natural and social sciences, particularly following the COVID-19 pandemic. Their use increased dramatically as the traditional publication system was shown to be not fit for purpose. It was just too slow. The rise of preprints, I think, is really interesting. It could be the start of a future where we do away with traditional journals and pre-publication peer review. It's an idea I find quite compelling. Won't talk more about it now, but feel free to pick up on that thread in the Q&A. Okay, there have been more changes that I haven't mentioned, but my takeaway message for this part of the talk is that researchers are sharing way more information than they used to. And this is true for both the individual research outputs, but also the volume of research outputs. More stuff is out there than ever before. Researchers like our friend Olive, trying to get through those bottlenecks to get funded and hired, they are expected to publish more than they used to. But at the same time as being more productive, they're also expected to do everything more transparently and make more information available for every paper. Something's got to give. Part 6, and because of that, more is being asked of researchers than ever before. Olive is curious and passionate about her research, but Olive is also tired. She's spending all of her time trying to be productive enough to keep up with her peers while also being worried about staying employed and winning funding. And on top of all that, she's now being asked to create these massive supplemental files and learn to write reproducible code and write descriptions of all her data variables. And where's she going to get the money from to pay for those open access fees? And how's she going to pre-register her analysis plans when she doesn't know that much about stats yet? It's just a lot yet. It's a lot. So last year, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to a woman named Claudia Goldin. She writes about greedy occupations or greedy jobs. A greedy job is one that expects long working hours, or at least it expects a level of productivity that few people can achieve without long working hours. And so greedy jobs will filter out people who can't or don't want to devote their free time to work. Academia is a greedy job. I bring this up because most of the changes that have come about from the open science movement have been individual solutions to what are systemic problems. So I started the story today with, once upon a time, scientists earned status and jobs by publishing new or surprising results. That has not changed. If anything, the competition for jobs and funds has been exacerbated by the budget cuts that we've been experiencing after the COVID-19 pandemic. At my home in Australia, if you compare early career researchers to people in other professions who are at similar career stages, it's the researchers who express more distress and dissatisfaction with their work life than normal. Selecting on productivity will further marginalise people who are disadvantaged to begin with. Some people think this is okay, though, that because science is just so important to society and to solving global problems that we need to be promoting productivity. We need to be promoting those productive researchers. The science has to come first. But that argument falls apart if productivity isn't related to quality, or even worse, if it's inversely related to quality, as in the model of the natural selection of bad science. So yes, much has changed to make research more transparent. But what is all that transparency for? It is meant to allow people to evaluate what was done. Olive can be transparent about what she did without what she did being any good. Transparency just makes it possible for others to evaluate whether what she did was good if they have enough time and motivation and expertise to do so, and those are all big ifs. So Olive does her best. She starts sharing her data, but it has errors in it that no one notices. She pre-registers her studies, but no one reads them. She shares her code, but no one runs her code to check whether it reproduces the results in her papers, let alone actually redoing her studies to check whether they replicate, so no one ever finds out if they're false positives or if they're generalizable. Part 7. And because of that, transparency is insufficient for a credibility revolution. I think it's telling that there are almost no replication studies published in ecology and evolution journals. So many studies would be feasible to try and replicate. In my home field of behavioral ecology, there are lots of short-term studies done on common systems that multiple groups have access to. You could try to replicate them without special funding or a lot of time. And there are journals that will publish replications. It's just that they don't get any submissions. So I've been thinking that this dearth of replication studies is an implicit acknowledgement of weak links between the outcomes of individual studies and the broader theories or the problems that people are interested in. I like this XKCD cartoon where a researcher says, we want to study this variable, but it's hard to observe, so we're studying this proxy variable. When asked, is it correlated with the other variable? The researcher doesn't know. And the caption to this cartoon is, our work has produced great answers. Now someone just needs to figure out which questions they go with. So more information is being made available than ever before, but we weren't making the most of the information that we already had available. Papers are published all the time with glaring errors that no one picks up. Very few people are employed to find and detect errors. We have the infrastructure for communities to be doing their own post-publication critique. There's websites like PubPeer, but they're mostly going unused. And if you look to those attention-grabbing cases of frauds, what strikes me is how often in those stories, the stories of villains and heroes, the evidence was just hiding in plain sight before someone sounded an alarm. And when those people did sound an alarm, they were told to stop making so much noise. So you might have heard of this case of Francesca Gino from Harvard, who sued the bloggers at Data Colada for $25 million. She sued them for finding glaring errors in her work that looked like fraud. It was just last week, actually, that the judge threw that case out, if you hadn't heard, so that's a good news story. But one of the people who brought those issues to those people's attention was a PhD student, And they were pressured to remove their criticism of Gino's work from their thesis by the committee because they found it too inflammatory. Quote, "Academic research is like a conversation at a cocktail party." So there are undeniably these social cohesion reasons why we don't dig into other people's papers and cause a fuss when they're unreliable. But quality control is also really rare because most people are just busy and stressed and doing their best under difficult circumstances. The university that I work at in Melbourne is a signatory of DORA, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment. And this is meant to do something to change how researchers are evaluated. It's meant to reduce those publish or perish pressures. But in practice, at my university, I hear of people who sit on selection committees and they're given over 100 job applications and less than a week to produce their shortlist of fewer than 10 candidates. How are they going to do that? It's simply impossible for them to evaluate the quality of people's research in that time. All that they can do is use indirect measures of productivity and impact and transparency, all of which can be gamified. So open science becomes open washing, Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Part 8, and because of that, the way scientists earn status and job security is slow to change. The more things change, the more they stay the same. If I sound fed up, it's because I am, and I'm not alone. While our friend Olive is doggedly pursuing her dream of professorship, many other tired early career researchers are opting out of systems that they're not happy with, and that can mean they change institutions, or they change research fields, or they change careers entirely. Over 50 years ago, Albert Hirschman wrote that the only time that exiting works to improve what was bad about what you left behind is when the people or the institutions that you walked away from care that they lost you. They have to miss you when you're gone. Now, I keep seeing the people who've been agitating for change in the open science movement, I keep seeing them leaving academia, or at least leaving the fields that they used to be interested in. And so I wonder what happens once the most agitated early and mid-career researchers have left. I worry that this feeling of crisis will subside and things will carry on much as they were with our careers built on individual productivity. I think that would be bad for science and bad for scientists for some of the reasons outlined in this talk by Richard McElreath called Science is like a chicken coop. He draws an analogy between groups of scientists and groups of chickens. As scientists, we want to maximize both basic and applied knowledge, while the chook farmers want to maximize egg production. In academia, we select for the individuals who produce the most papers, who get the most citations. But they tried that with the chooks and it went horribly wrong. It meant that they bred the most aggressive, antisocial hens, the ones that would peck and kill each other. Okay, so instead, chook farmers turned to group selection. They decided to select at the level of the chicken coop that would produce the highest egg counts. And that drastically improved their overall production of eggs, as well as decreasing the amount of bullies and cannibals. Doesn't that sound nicer than pecking each other to death? So here's a paper that extends on that argument that we should be promoting teams in science more than individual superstars. Incidentally, the first author on that paper has left academia. Okay, if at this point in my story you're feeling a bit down about things, I get it, but don't worry. All hope is not lost. I will now attempt the rousing pivot towards an optimistic resolution. Part 9. Until eventually, researchers banded together to change the institutions they rely upon. So all of these concerns about the quality of scientific research are not new. People have been sounding alarms for decades. But I have been told by wiser people than me that something does feel different this time round with the current open science movement. Perhaps helped by the internet, researchers and advocates are coordinating more both within disciplines and across them, and there's been more buy-in from institutions. Okay, most of those changes have been at the level of transparency, not credibility. We can accuse those institutions of open washing, but where some things have changed, surely there's hope that more can be changed too. As single individuals, institutions are unlikely to miss us when we're gone. If you use your voice, you'll feel like you're shouting into a void. But you can find power in collective action, and if not power, you can find company and camaraderie. So I found this company, and you can too, by becoming a member of SORTEE, the Society for Open, Reliable and Transparent Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. In December this year, SORTEE is going to turn 4 years old. I've been there since the beginning, and I've watched it grow stronger every year. At the moment, we've got a great group of 70 volunteers who work across 10 different committees. Our members are spread across the world. They're mostly students and early career researchers, as you might expect. Our membership fees are entirely optional. You can join for free, and we run a bunch of free events for members, including our annual virtual conference next month in October. Starting at 10 p.m. on the 15th of October here, local time, until 6 a.m. on the 16th. It runs continuously. It's online, so it's accessible to everyone. There are a couple of plenary talks in the program, but most of the program is interactive. We have workshops and hackathons, and then more free-form discussions. As well as the virtual events, we also organise in-person meetups for SORTEE members that are attached to existing in-person conferences. This has been really lovely. I've made good friends through SORTEE that I'd only met online. We also run the preprint server archive. We have monthly workshops and webinars. We have a virtual code club. I could point to more concrete outputs, but in general, I think one of the most important contributions of that open science community is to be a home for the olives of the world, to feel supported as they try to navigate the peculiarities of their careers, while also conducting good research and not allowing greedy work to consume their one precious life. So the last time I gave a version of this talk, it was online, and over the coming days kept logging into my membership platform with decreasing hope in my heart because I got no new members to join. I thought, what's going on? And people seemed like they were really into it. So I've added this slide to remind you that I was like, have I just made it sound like too much of a thing, that if you join SORTEE, you'll then have to do stuff and be part of this community, and maybe you don't want a new thing. So you can just join and do nothing. We don't send that many emails. You don't have to join the Slack space. You can join for free. Please join. Later, I'm going to log onto my membership platform. I would love to see some new members from the Carey Institute. It does help us because the fundraising committee can talk about membership growth when they're trying to attract new supporters. Also, I have stickers, free stickers to hand out if anyone would like some hex stickers, and some pamphlets here. So yeah, please join SORTEE. Okay. Part 10, and every day since then, that's up to you. I've spoken a lot in this talk about the publish or perish incentives, but I also want to give a nod to a blog post by Tal Yarkoni called "No, it's not the incentives, it's you." I think we should try as much as we can to band together and try to change those institutional incentives, but change is hard and slow. The only thing that you can really control is how you choose to behave, what you do as a researcher, a supervisor, a student, a peer reviewer, an editor, a lab mate. Olive doesn't have to take her supervisor's advice at face value. She has some autonomy. Let's assume that she doesn't have one of those horrible toxic supervisor relationships. Well, then she might be able to change her supervisor's mind a little bit, gradually, over time. The scope of open science is vast, and there are lots of small opportunities for improvement. When you wade into all of the guidelines about best practices and how we should be doing research, remember that those are aspirational ideals. You cannot be doing everything right everywhere all at once. Do not be deterred by the overwhelming feeling of inadequacy. Try again, fail better. Also, do not wait for there to come a day when you feel senior enough to push back against the practices you don't agree with, because that day might never come. I've heard from a lot of people who seem like they're in positions of power, seniority, and authority who still claim that they don't feel powerful or senior enough to do anything. So if not now, then when? I don't know whether this current open science movement and all of those increases in transparency, I don't know whether they're going to be a paradigm shift towards a credibility revolution, but there's only one way to find out. And with that, thank you for listening, and I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay. we are going to thank you so much for coming all this way and for presenting this. And I want to say, while you're all thinking of your questions, maybe 2 years ago, I got an email from, and I know Chris was on this email too, from our colleague Dave Strayer, who I don't believe is online, but is a retired Carey scientist, who said, I just saw the best talk. You have got to invite Rose O'Day, here's her email, to come give a talk at the Carey. No details, but if you know Dave, that was such a recommendation, such a clear recommendation that no details were needed. And we've been trying to get Dr. O'Day here ever since, and I'm absolutely not disappointed. Like, great talk, and so much that we all need to think about. I hope everyone in the room's a little excited, a little uncomfortable, and ready to talk. So choose who you want to ask a question. You ask the question, I'm going to repeat it, and then Rose will answer it.
Thank you so much. It was really a great talk and tons to think about. So one thing I'm curious about is I understand how it's a little different, but so much of research doesn't happen until you get funding, and isn't a big part of that kind of what you're somewhat proposing of the checking the plan ahead of time? Isn't that kind of what a proposal does? And so is it just posting the proposal before you post the paper? Or is it more just you want to get down to that minutia?
Okay, so the question from Dr. Jane Lucas is, where does the research proposal that most often has to be successful to fund a study prior to the study happening fit into this framework and into the open science movement?
Yeah, so I would say that the idea of a registered report would be, the study methods would be evaluated in a lot greater detail than they would in, say, a grant proposal. And of course, I'm not familiar with all granting agencies, and maybe they work more effectively at most places. But in Australia, I would say that most funding applications, have all those hype words. People are really trying to oversell their research in order to get the funding. And there's also little follow through afterwards. So people, get the funding, but then no one's going back to check that they did what they said they were going to do. So I don't think that is really achieving the same thing that a registered report would be, when that's explicitly tied to whether you get published. So in the registered report, they say, you can get feedback, and then they say, okay, we will publish what you find, regardless of the results that you find. Does that make sense? Oh, okay, right at the back.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. You can hear me from back here?
Yeah.
Great. So there's a part of the picture that you didn't talk about in this talk that's quite near my heart, which is the matter of open science software. I maintain 4 R packages, and you get a publication when you first create an R package, but then to keep it going, you need to keep maintaining it over time as part of the open source ecosystem, and you don't get any credit for anything after that, but it's completely necessary. There might be thousands of researchers who rely on your software to do their stuff. So I guess a question that I often think of, and I'm just interested in your perspective on, is how do we promote the maintenance of high quality open source science software?
Okay, so the question was specific to open science software and R package creation and maintenance as being a job that often is not rewarded or recognized in science, but probably a critical part of the open science ecosystem. And the question is, how does that change, and what have you thought about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know how you get there, but I think it's pretty obvious that you need more people to be paid to do that kind of maintenance work. People who've done a meta-analysis would know the R package metaphor, run by Wolfgang Fischbauer. I met him once, and he said that he gets no credit from his institution for metaphor, which is this huge contribution to the research community. I think it's tied to this sort of system of, you pay people to innovate, to make new things, and you get exciting things coming out all the time that then break because people stop maintaining them and people's whole research pipeline won't work. Or even with SORTEE, we're trying to think about how do we get funding, and it's hard unless you're proposing, look, we're going to create this big new thing. It's really hard to get funding for just those incremental maintenance things. Also, I know like a lot of people who would be quite happy to just be a postdoc if they could only just be a postdoc in terms of helping other people. They don't necessarily want to run their own lab and be the sort of superstar. Like they like helping people with their scripts and their methodology, and there aren't enough roles for those sorts of people. So I don't know how we change the system in order to create roles for those people, but yeah, I agree that it's really needed.
Hi, this was excellent, super exciting stuff. It makes sense to me that the framework is to shift at an institutional level and not necessarily an individual level. I find myself wondering, is there any worry that this open science ecosystem will become part of the hype? That in fact, if we reward it at an institutional level, that we might have folks who maybe talk the talk but don't walk the walk?
So the question is there concern that the open science movement itself becomes the hype and has its own challenge of kind of a greenwashing of practices that are in name only?
Yeah, I am concerned about that because we're not paying the people to actually go in and check all these materials that become available. So I worry that transparency becomes the signal of reliability. And so people go, well, look, they've shared their data, their code, they pre-registered their studies, they must be good. But no one's checking whether, and when people do studies, when they compare pre-registrations to the published studies, often there's changes that no one's picked up. Or I've been a reviewer for a meta-sciencey paper where I went into their Excel file and I found just really obvious errors, like the drag had not done and it didn't really change anything, but I pointed out these errors. The other reviewers were like, well done, you shared your materials, but no one had checked them. So yes, I am worried about that.
I want to jump in with a question online. Would public awareness of the issues and challenges help or hinder the progress, such as by changing university policies and practices? What's the open science movement doing in regard to public outreach?
So often people get concerned about meta-science and it's linked to science denial or trust in science. They don't really want to air our dirty laundry in public. I think that's a mistake because I feel like, exactly with the case of medical research, people donate a lot of money to medical research. And I feel like if there was more public pressure on these sorts of things that could help change policies, or even peer review. So I spoke about that idea that we could get away with pre-publication peer review. One of the arguments for doing that is that the public has this perception that peer review works as a good quality control filter. They say, where are the peer-reviewed studies? Studies have shown. And as we know, peer review doesn't work that well on lots of dimensions of quality. It's a bad filter. Have I slightly lost the thread of the question?
Have you thought about what getting the public involved in the public outreach, presumably as a public demanding transparency, does for open science?
Yeah. I like to think it would be good. It's tricky because then, we had some fraud cases in Australia that then got caught up because they were around the ocean acidification and the fish behavior, that they get picked up by people who are denying the effects of climate change, and so that's sort of uncomfortable. But I guess my leaning is that people should have trust in science because we deserve it, not because we just present this veneer of credibility and say, no, take our word for it. So I think we should bump up against that uncomfortable criticism and then show that we're actually responding and improving how we do research. And I think psychology sort of noticed in the general public because the replication crisis received so much attention that then you would hear people talk about, psychology like talking it down. But I think they've come through that and made a lot of changes that will make them stronger in the future.
Great talk. That was really fun to hear. Thank you. I was curious. So here you were disgruntled. You found a solution. You created the community SORTEE. You're also embedded in an academic institution as a postdoc. And so I was curious if you've been able to personally make changes at Melbourne Uni, and your thoughts, if you cared, if you were willing to share them. Or is academia the place where you're seeing a future trajectory?
Okay, so the question is for personal experience as a student and then postdoc embedded in academia. Were you able to make changes? Are you able to make changes? What kind? And where do you think you're headed?
So no, I haven't felt like I've made changes at my institution. We've actually been talking about this within SORTEE about Kaya Gam, who some of you will know, as keen for us to be acting as a place where people can come for help in order to start more of a grassroots community at their local network. So I think I said SORTEE has members in 46 countries. I think there's 17 countries that just has one SORTEE person. So they're very isolated. So I would love it if we could work towards building stronger communities, because that's, I think, how more change could happen. I've been lucky in my current postdoc at Melbourne. I'm on an independent research fellowship, so I don't have a boss, I don't have accountability, and so I've just been basically doing SORTEE things, which is, I feel slightly guilty about that, but also, yeah, that's how I've chosen to spend my time. And no, I don't see a future for myself in academia, which is why I haven't been, minding about publishing papers.
Really complicated stuff here. One of the things that's kind of rattling around in my head after hearing you is your chicken coop analogy. And I wonder to what extent, and you've thought through kind of how that team selection model, how that would work and kind of some of the details of it and what some pros and cons of it might be. And if you don't have any thoughts on that, it's fine. I just wondered if you've thought more about it.
Okay, so the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is thinking about the chicken coop model, how do you see that having played out in the real world, and what are the pros and cons?
How could it play out?
How could it play out
Be good about it.
in your experience of academia, and are there positive outcomes and negative?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. It's one of those sort of utopia visions that you're like, if we could just start from scratch, we'd like things to be set up like that. But I don't know how you get there. It's hard with the, how global research is too, thinking of these, distributed research networks. Someone's got to get the funding for this thing, but then how are we sharing the credit, the division of labor? Yeah, but in general, you would like to see more stable long-term funding, more modular division of labor, where you could have people who were, just working on their R package, maintaining it, and people who were just really good experimentalists, not having to do everything, and therefore being jack of all trades, master of none. Right here.
So I really loved how you framed the story around the researcher, because we can relate to that. But I wonder how you would revise the story if it was framed around a program director at a funding agency, or a dean at a university, or even a public publishing executive, who are the people that give us money and take our money.
The question is, how might you reframe the story from the focus on an early career researcher, if from the perspective of a publishing agent or one of the people running one of the publication journals, a dean, or a program director at one of the funding agencies?
Can I ask what your job is?
I'm a researcher,
Okay.
so I relate to all.
Yeah. So I don't know, because as an early career researcher, those other jobs are like a black box to me. It's very mysterious. I don't know what goes on there.
Hi, so you have a little bit of all those people in the room today. So I guess my question is, has to do with how a lot of our institutions kind of measure ourselves and our impact in science. And what's the impact factor of the internal as determined by whomever. But like, what are some really compelling stories or metrics you would encourage an institution to gather or to share that would tell a better story about like team science or collaborations, or I mean like just like what to you tells a better story of science than we published this many papers this year?
What metrics do you think might tell a better story than the common ones currently used, that institutions might use to evaluate how well someone has done in a given year?
I think it's really hard. So everyone agrees that the current metrics are bad. I haven't heard anyone come up with a better system. And I think part of it is because it's so, it requires disciplinary expertise. And so the metrics are appealing because they can be applied by people who don't know that much about the system, and because our research becomes so specialized that it's hard for you as a non-expert to work out whether something is, influential or good or not. If you look up SORTEE's YouTube channel, we had a plenary at a conference a few years ago by a philosopher called C2 Nguyen. It's called Transparency is Surveillance, and it's about the tension between transparency and expertise. He writes about the thing with, so experts by definition, they understand things that non-experts don't. So if you require the decisions of experts to be understandable, justifiable to non-experts, then experts either lie about their real reasons for a decision, or they restrict themselves to just a subset of reasons that can be understood by the non-expert audience. And I think that's happened a bit with evaluating research. But of course, where you get expert judgment, there's also lots of bias, nepotism, subjectivity that resides there. And so, there are benefits to having simplified metrics because everyone understands the rules of the game. But I think testimonials and a more narrative structure around what research meant and the impact of it, that has some benefits there. And a big problem, I think, is that there's just too much research to evaluate and present that story. And yeah, some places are changing their evaluations to say, just give us your best paper of the past 5 years, or give us a shorter list because we don't want everything. So that's aimed to sort of help that. But everyone's so overworked and not actually, you go to journal clubs. Maybe it's different here because you guys seem to have a really nice research culture. Most journal clubs I go to, people haven't even read the paper for journal club. We only have one journal club every 2 weeks. So I just don't think people are reading as many papers as they claim, That's kind of a rambling answer. But so for me personally, what I like is when I get an email from someone out of the blue saying, I read your paper and it helped me in these specific ways. Also, all the service that I do, those are, I guess they call them soft skills, but things that create contributions that are hard to evaluate because you can't tell if you read someone's CV if they've sat on committees, if they've contributed actively to them or not. But yeah, down here.
Yeah, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much. So yesterday we had a lively discussion during dinner about something. I wonder about your opinion on that. So it's about billion-dollar for-profit, gigantic scientific publishers. So are they part of the solution or part of the problem?
The big billion-dollar funding? Publishing, right? So the publishing companies that are bringing in lots of money and have a big, almost industrial organization, are they part of the solution or part of the problem?
Part of the problem. Yeah.
That was a clear answer and not a bad moment to stop. So thank you all again for coming. Thank you, Dr. O'Day, for coming. We will be in the lunchroom. She has a pretty full schedule the rest of the day, but for the next hour we'll be in the lunchroom, as will the stickers and the flyers. So join us. Thank you.
Thank you.